Thank you. Before diving into the case study in which we developed overweight personas, I'm wondering who of you has already used or constructed personas? Quite a few, okay. And what, according to you, makes a good persona? What are the characteristics or the criteria? Because that was one of the questions that I asked myself at the beginning of this project. Any ideas? Yeah? What?
Theory, just like what you're going to talk about.
Yeah, theory. Something else?
Relatable.
Okay. What?
Almost say anti-relatable. Think of something that's not about you.
Yeah, yeah. But more a representation of, yeah.
Something outside of your
Yeah.
assumptions.
Yeah, okay. If you look at the description of Cooper, he sees personas as user archetypes, which means that they are hypothetical users that represent a broad cross-section of real users. And according to Cooper, personas help you empathize with these users and filter out incorrect assumptions that you might have about them. And especially if those target groups, for instance, children, or in my case, people with obesity, are far removed from your own world of experience, these personas are believed to be very useful tools to inform design decisions, but also as a communication tool within a team. And in general, if you look at different approaches to construct personas, it comes down to three broad phases. First, you kind of collect data, either quantitative or qualitative, or a combination of both, about the specific user needs and the context of use. Then, of course, you analyze these data, you look for patterns of needs across different users. And then finally, you use this or these insights to develop a limited set of distinct personas, each with their own narrative. And so the important thing here is that personas are based on research, they're fact-based, so they should present real rather than stereotypical users. However, if you look at the web, you see a lot of not so good examples, and I hope, my camera is in the room there and is connecting. Okay, here we are again. So this example, I hope the person who made these personas is not in the room today, because I don't think it is a good example. And why not? What you see is four shiny, happy people with kind of silly names like Iggy the Influencer and Marketing Mark. And to me, these personas kind of lack nuance. They look more like, I think, a set of LinkedIn profiles, and we all know how realistic those are. And if you look at the description in the bottom, you will see that what's only included are some vague experience goal, but no end goals, no tasks for using a specific service or product. So it's kind of superficial in a way, and I don't think these personas are based on actual research, but are just made up. So that brings us back to my project, a case study on obesity. The aim of this project was called Be Slim, was to develop an evidence-based digital coach to help people suffering from obesity to lose weight in a sustainable manner. And we all know, I think, that losing excess body weight is very difficult to many people. It requires healthy eating patterns, an increase in physical activity often, and also a willingness to change certain behaviors and sustain these behaviors. And because of this complexity, we worked together in a multidisciplinary team. So there was us, design researchers and people from HEI, but also research from clinical imaging, from nutrition, physical activities, and then a couple e-health companies. So we collaborated during 2 years. Now, for us as HEI researchers, in the beginning, we also faced some challenges. The first one was that we only had limited domain-specific knowledge about obesity and the causes and the complexity of this problem. And because of that, we might have had a lot of incorrect assumptions about overweight people, about this target group. And especially for me, I've never suffered from obesity, so it was kind of hard to imagine the motivational dynamics at play. What were the specific obstacles and barriers? So that were all kind of challenges. And then the last one was that in the beginning of the project, I often had no clue what the domain experts in the project were talking about. And I think vice versa as well when I was discussing design approaches and methods and applications. So there was really a lack of a common language between these different stakeholders in the team. So, and these challenges combined were kind of the main reason why we chose to develop personas in the first place. And what we did then was we turned these challenges into requirements for our personas. And I'm not going to discuss each of them, but the most important one is that we, instead of just relying on a bottom-up approach to develop our personas, we wanted to combine a data-driven and a more theory top-down approach. We really wanted to incorporate insights from behavioral theory to kind of compensate for our lack of domain knowledge. And the theory that we chose was self-determination theory, and the reason was quite simple. We informed by the domain experts in the team, and they suggested this theory because it was basically the framework they used a lot. I don't know if anyone familiar with this theory? See some people nodding, yeah. Now, according to this theory, if you want to change your behavior in a sustainable manner, motivation needs to be self-determined. It should come from within and shouldn't be externally controlled. And to obtain such intrinsic motivation, there are three basic psychological needs that need to be satisfied: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Let me give you an example. If a person suffering from obesity thinks that he's genetically determined to be overweighted, he might perceive a very low level of autonomy because he thinks that it lies not in his power to kind of change his behavior. That person may also perceive a low level of competence when he, for instance, misses certain skills. Maybe he cannot cook a healthy meal, he doesn't know which ingredients to choose, so then it's a very specific skill that he's lacking. And then finally, we'll also have like a low perception of relatedness when he finds it really important to have active support in his struggle against obesity, to find, for instance, a sport buddy to do physical activities together with, but he cannot find someone like that in his group of friends. On the contrary, if all these three psychological needs are met, according to self-determination theory, in that case, motivation is much more likely to be intrinsic and sustainable as well in a way. Now, according to the theory, someone's motivation can be positioned on a continuum from not motivated at all on the left to completely intrinsically regulated or motivated. And the idea is that if you want to change someone's behavior in the long term, you need to guide them towards the right on the continuum. You need to make sure that their motivation internalizes, that becomes more intrinsic. And how do you do that? Well, by looking at these three basic psychological needs and kind of looking at to what degree they are satisfied or not, and focusing your intervention on that. So that brings us back to the persona procedure. The procedure that you see here is loosely based on Cooper's work, but then in each of these stages we kind of applied principles from self-determination theory. And I will discuss each of these steps in a bit. Let me first show you an example. You can't read it, of course, but that's not a problem, I guess. You see Mark here, quite a young guy. You see this quite text-dense, the persona, but that is because we really wanted to, in a quite detailed manner, describe his willingness to change his behavior, the barriers he faces. We also included some quotes. So we really wanted to include like a current scenario of his current situation. I will discuss another one in more detail later on in my presentation, but I can already say that the 5 distinct personas that we developed are available online, so I'll share the link afterwards with you and feel free to have a look. So that brings us to the first stage of our persona procedure. So as you would normally do, we wanted to gather detailed contextual knowledge about our target group. So we recruited 20 people with obesity, and then we first asked them to fill in a survey, a standardized scale that is used in the kind of clinical trials to really quite accurately define their motivation on this motivational continuum and for different aspects. And we would use that information afterwards to kind of complement our qualitative interview data. So and then we also used the theory to determine the interview topics in our protocol, which you can see here. So basically, during these interviews, we last for 1.5 to 2 hours. We discussed 4 main topics: nutrition, of course, physical activity, how they perceived their health, their weight, and a healthy weight. And then there was a group of other factors, including, for instance, the impact of digital media. And then for each of these topics, we discussed previous and current attitudes and behavior, as well as aspirations for the future. So there were 3 moments in time, and we tried to connect the interrelationship or try to gain insight into the interrelationship. And then in addition, for each of these moments in time, we discussed how they perceive their autonomy, competence, relatedness for each of these main topics, and how, for instance, a previous attempt, a failed attempt to lose weight has influenced their current perception of their autonomy and competence, etc. And as you can see as well, the 3 basic psychological needs below were subdivided. For instance, competence was subdivided into knowledge about how to lose weight, but also having specific skills, which is a more kind of active implementation of that knowledge. And then also self-efficacy. And self-efficacy relates to the idea or the perception of the knowledge and competences that you have. And because sometimes you see, for instance, that someone has the skills and the knowledge to change his behavior, but perceives that they don't have it. So then it's a matter of perception more than a lack of skills. So that's just one example from how we operationalize these constructs. So in the next step then, we coded the interviews. But instead of just doing an open bottom-up coding process, we kind of also combine it with top-down constructs derived from the theory. So it was really a mix of both. So in line with Cooper's approach, of course, we identified tasks and goals. But then in addition, relying on SET, we focused really on the need for relatedness again, competence and autonomy. And it were these extra focus points that really helped us to more accurately define different groups of user behavior in this analysis. And the result of this stage was a set of behavioral variables, for instance, different needs regarding relatedness, different barriers that these people faced. And in the next phase, we turned these variables into different axes, and I will show you an example right away. And we visually mapped each subject to these axes, and the aim was to accurately represent how each interview subject scores on each variable in relationship to the other subjects, and to look for patterns and start grouping similar behaviors together. So here's an example of some of the axes. We had more, so we subdivided different types of motivations for these different constructs that we had. And the red circles with letter in it represent the interview subjects. And then you have different circles and lines in different colors. And these represent similar behavior for at least 2 or more participants over multiple axes, so for multiple behaviors. And basically, these different colors from almost a blueprint for the different personas. And each of these personas would then need a different coaching strategy to change their behavior in a sustainable manner. So in the next phase, in the last phase, we started synthesizing the data for each cluster in a series of bullet points. And this resulted in what we call persona skeletons, which is really the intermediate step between abstract behavioral patterns on the one side and then the actual personas on the other side. Then we started adding relevant and attitudinal details from each interview subject belonging to a certain cluster. And then finally, we turned these bullet points into third-person narrative. We added some quotes and visuals, and it is in this last step that the personas really came to life. So here you see another example, Annie, a somewhat older woman who really doesn't like to take an attempt to change her weight. She's really not that motivated. She's a very busy socializer, who has really other priorities. She also likes reading. She doesn't cook often, and if she cooks, she wants it to be very tasty, not healthy. Physical activity, she thinks it's more like a waste of time. But that doesn't mean she never does sport, because sometimes her relatives who are becoming increasingly worried about her health try to trick her into doing sports and being more physically active by making bets for her, for instance, which is a very extrinsic motivator. But then once this external motivator fades, she immediately falls back into her old routine. So that's a bit the trap where she's suffering from, in a way. But Annie believes that if she wanted to change her behavior, she would have the competences to do so. So she feels like it is in her power to do so. But if she would do such an attempt, she would really need very active support from her relatives, which she more or less has, but she doesn't have, for instance, someone that will do sports with her together. And she would prefer a very highly personalized training or coaching trajectory. Does someone recognize him or herself in Annie's lack of motivation? No one. That's good, I think. Yeah. That brings us to future work, and actually it's no longer future work because the project finished already in the meanwhile. So what did we do with these personas? Because of course, constructing the personas is one thing, but using them in the design process is another thing. So first thing that we did is we used these as a starting point in a series of ideation workshops with project partners, but also again with the patients. Patients, I mean people with obesity, clients. And now we use these ideas to start developing prototypes for the digital coach, which was, of course, a very iterative process. And during that process, the personas kind of served as a reference tool. It was also used sometimes to enhance communication and to focus our attention again on the real needs when we were a bit distracted by, for instance, technical feasibilities, etc. And then finally, when the prototype for the digital coach was ready, we did a clinical trial with 160 people, and with a subset of these participants, we did a summative user experience evaluation, and one of these tasks in this evaluation was that we presented the personas and that we asked and discussed to what degree they recognize themselves in one of these personas. So we really used them throughout the whole design and development process. And that brings me by the conclusion of my presentation. I think, at least in our experience, self-determination theory really helped us to enrich our data collection at the early stages of the process, and it informed our interview protocol. I don't think that certain questions that we asked, that we would have come up with these questions ourselves, for instance, like the subtle differences between skills, knowledge, self-efficacy, for instance. But it also stimulated ad hoc reflection in some of our interviewees, for instance, the concept of relatedness. Also for the analysis, it helped us to kind of not just start from an open coding process, but also have some more top-down coding structure. So it provided the necessary structure and it made it a bit more rigorous, I think. And most importantly, I think, is that the resulting personas represented real users that were quite ambiguous, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, because I think life in the end is quite ambiguous. They really provided insight into how these three psychological basic needs interplay, and they also provided a very nuanced picture of the different types and degrees of motivation, as well as the interviewee's future needs for a digital coach. Thank you for listening.
Hi, Margaret Burnett, Oregon State.
Hi.
I love this work.
Thank you.
So here. We've also been using theory-based personas, and and our process wasn't exactly the same as yours, so we have some sort of complementary things here. But one advantage we saw that you might also be seeing is that by using theory-based personas, when you find a mismatch, you know why. And so that tends to be prescriptive. And so, like, for example, you know, the self-efficacy thing, we say, no, this is never going to work for our persona because, you know, she has low computer self-efficacy. And so then that gives some ideas about how to fix it instead of just saying, oh, doesn't work.
Yeah.
So, keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
It's both a remark and a question. Have you met people from the fat positivity movement?
From the?
Fat positivity movement?
No.
Okay, because there's a huge online community on people who are considered to be in obesity situation and who eat healthy and who have physical physical activities, who don't experience health problems, but still every time they go to the doctor tells them you have to lose weight, even though there's no issue with that weight. And I think these people would be very offended to be told that this is an issue of self-advocacy or of motivations, because they just consider that being overweight is not an issue.
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
I see where you're going, and of course it's a very ethical problem almost, and that's one of the reasons why we, for instance, when we work with people with obesity again during the ideation session, that we started from the personas, not to make it too personal as well. In terms of how we recruited people and really the project objectives was determined by the Department of Physical Activity, so we had not a lot of influence on that, unfortunately. But there were a lot of exclusion criteria. For instance, there couldn't be any comorbidities, because of course there can be other reasons as well for obesity, of course. So these kind of people were all excluded. I think it's indeed a sensitive topic, and we and our colleagues had similar questions during the project. But then again, what do you do? Because the alternative at this point is for people who want it but don't feel competent to do it. The only alternatives are a lot of wearables and health trackers, but that are not evidence-based. So that was kind of the gap that we wanted to fill, I think. But I will definitely look into it. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sindhu Irnala from Georgia Tech. Great talk. By the way, I have two questions for you. The first is, among the users that you've interviewed, do you see everyone fitting into one particular persona class, or are there overlaps? Like, does one individual fall under both? Two different kinds of personas? Yeah,
we ended up with 5 different personas, and it's not that we, in the beginning, said we want 5 personas. It was really, we looked at what you saw, like the different axes with the different clusters, and there were more than 5 clusters coming up, but some were a bit too marginal in a way that it was only like 2 participants over like 3 clusters, so that were the one that we eliminated, as you can say. So in that sense, it's a bit of a data simplification a little bit, but of course at the same time, if you want to be able to communicate these perspectives or these results in an easy and visible way, then I think you don't have much more choice than kind of trying to limit these personas.
Sure, I understand.
Yeah.
But was there any user who really fit into, say, persona A and persona B? Like
there were a couple,
Okay.
that really fit really into one persona. And I didn't mention that, but when we were adding like behavioral and attitudinal details to the persona, of course some personas were, or some interview subjects were included more than others, depending on the relative fit. So yeah, that was definitely the case.
Okay.
Yeah.
My second question was, persona, the way we understand it, is kind of evolving over time. So especially in the case of the obese users that you've looked at. So how do you, I'm just curious to know your thoughts. Do you think the persona types will stick over time, or is it possible that there is some dynamic evolution or change in persona?
I think they will probably change, and I think these personas were really targeted on a Belgian culture. I think if you would use the same personas here in the States, you wouldn't probably capture all the problems or the barriers. So I think you really need to, although we shared them online, I think you should be really careful with using personas that we develop for a very specific context and using them in other contexts, I think. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, Chandra
Hi.
from the University of Michigan. It's great to see theory-driven health behavior work. It's super exciting. But I was hoping that you could talk a little bit more about if you considered other theory frameworks like social cognitive theory or trans-theoretical model, and why you selected the self-determination theory.
Well, we didn't really look into that much other theories, I must be honest about that. But one of our conclusions is that we think it shouldn't be self-determination theory, of course. I think, again, depending on the project, another behavioral theory may be more suited to guide this process. And that was, at least that's our recommendation. But the reason why we did it is, again, because of the project consortium and that the domain experts heavily rely on that theory. And it was also already written into the proposal that was kind of the framework. And that was, for us, kind of the rationale to apply that theory. So in a way, a bit of a pragmatic rationale, I think. Yeah.
Great. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.